Hello, I am John Clark. It is Wednesday, May 3rd, 2017, and I am in the home of Sid and Janet Druen, 85 East Deshler Street, right?
Right,
with
Deshler Avenue, actually.
Avenue. I have trouble with those. Thank you, Sid. I'd like to start by hearing about your background personally, going back to your early days, your education, and so forth.
Oh, well, I was born in a very small town in Virginia, and actually named after a local college down there called Hampden-Sydney College, and I went to Hampden-Sydney. I always joked that my mother should have called me John Harvard, and I would have gone to Harvard. But anyway, it was a good school, and from there I went to the University of Virginia Law School. And from law school I worked in the governor's office for a couple of years. During the time I was in law school I met Janet, and we decided to get married. She went to graduate school at Ohio State, so I came up here in 1970 we got married, and I moved here in 1970 to find a job. Luckily I found a job at Nationwide, a very entry-level position that was at the time a junior attorney.
So you came here about 1970?
1970.
And how did you meet Janet?
I met Janet on a blind date, and she went to school in Lynchburg, Virginia, which was nearby. And we had known each other for about 3 years before we decided to get married.
And you came here in 1970, and what did you rent? Did you buy? Starting again, I got to get a shot at Cassie. Hello, Cassie. All right, so Sid, you were telling me about living in the university area.
Living in the university area when we first moved here, because Janet was just going to school, and we thought we'd be here a couple of years and then go back to Virginia. I had a job in the governor's office in Virginia, and so I thought Virginia was my future. It's interesting, when I interviewed at Nationwide, they asked me, I think I was going to go back to Virginia. And I was very honest. I said, sure, I'll be here at least 2 years, because it'll take my wife that long to get her degree. And so the guy that hired me suggested that if I would agree to stay 3 years, he would give me the job, figuring that at the end of 3 years, if they didn't have me interested in staying, then I should go back. Needless to say, I spent 30 years at Nationwide.
And it turned out to be a pretty good path.
It was a good path for me. I got to do a lot of things I had never imagined I would be able to do.
What kinds of work did you do there?
I was hired as a real estate attorney, and then I was an investment attorney, and then securities. Toward the end of my career at Nationwide, I did insurance. So many of the things that were happening at Nationwide around the plaza area, the land acquisition, all of that kind of stuff. We did that on the long period of time of land acquisition. We even did the acquisition for the land under the AEP building and sold it to AEP because we wanted to introduce them to come to Columbus. So there was a lot of interesting projects. Probably it sounds more interesting than it was, but there are two projects that stand out as most interesting to me. One, I did because we owned radio TV stations, I did a game contract for the Green Bay Packers, because we owned the Green Bay radio and TV station, actually the TV station in Green Bay. And so the contract was sent up to our office, and I put it together. It's mainly standard form, but it was fun. It was fun to say I did a Green Bay Packers contract. This is in the early days when Green Bay Packers were a big deal. And the other thing I was sort of specialized in was buying and selling airplanes. It was very much like buying and selling a car. There was a registration and all of that. But you get to a certain point where you get pretty used to being the go-to person for something, and when they'd buy a new airplane, they'd call me, and I'd get a chance to go to meet with the brokers and bring a green plane in and just review the contracts for outfitting them with avionics and what have you. And then after the sale, we would make sure that the titles passed and all that. It was really fun.
These were all corporate planes?
Corporate, it was all corporate, yes. I didn't do any private practice at all, really. It was all corporate. It was fun.
So Janet graduated, and then about, I guess, 3 years after that, you came to German Village.
Yes, it was about 3 years. Janet found jobs teaching in local colleges after she graduated, and she was moving around. And so when we moved to the German Village, we were down, great landlady, Liz Stevens, down on 181 Deshler. And indeed, I was walking not this dog, but my other dog one morning about 1975, and there had been a fire in this building, and the executor of the estate was here, and a contractor. They were looking over the damage, and I asked the guy if he was going to sell it, and he said, yeah, he thought he probably would. And so I said, we'd like to be interested in it. And he said, well, yeah, I'll give you first refusal if you want. Janet had never seen it. He was an interesting guy. He was a wonderful person, and his word was, we found out, was bond. But when I quickly got Janet, we walked through the place. It was in shambles, actually there had been deferred maintenance since the 50s. So we were able to work out a deal that we would move in, help clean it up, and then do the revision, the work on it, getting it rehabbed and all after we bought it. But things needed to be done right away. For instance, it was just it was with no maintenance for 20 or 30 years. You can imagine things just had to be done. Roof, number one. One of the things that we needed to have was the King brothers. In those days, only the King brothers were the roofers that everybody used. They knew to do it right, and they knew how to do German village roofs.
Did you have a slate roof then?
We had a slate roof then, and one of the regrets is we couldn't save that slate roof. As we were getting this house under control, the carriage house behind this house was actually condemned. So we had to do something about getting that rehabbed, and ran into a great contractor and did a complete restoration of that carriage house. It's rented, that was, gosh, so many years ago, and it's been rented ever since, just about. I don't think we've had 2 blank months in that whole time.
I've heard a lot about condemned buildings down here. Once a building is condemned by the city, how do you go about getting it uncondemned?
Well, it's interesting because we thought that you couldn't, there was no, we thought when the building was condemned that it was, it had to be rehabbed. You couldn't let it fall down. It was against code. We were young, we didn't know any better, and we had to restore it. So that's what we believed, and so we took those steps. Looking back on it, we were very fortunate to understand now that we had options, but in those days we didn't know we had options, and so we set about. We found a great Richard Becker, a great craftsman and contractor, who took all the siding off, lifted it up, put a new foundation around it, put it back down, laid a slab floor with heat vents and stuff underneath it, plumbing, and then rebuilt it basically using the same frame and the same siding so that it qualified for historical restoration, which it did. And as we were getting it finished and deciding what kind of roof to put it on it, we had a lady who was a doctor at Children's who wanted to move in, and she was going to pay the rent. So we decided, hey, let's splurge, and we put a new slate roof on that property. In sort of a touch that I liked, because it came from my area of Virginia. It's called Buckingham Slate, which is one of the best slate areas. And because one of my relatives worked there, we got into ship order up to here, and we were able to put on a new slate roof. And to this day, it's been a long time, that roof has never had any maintenance done whatsoever. So it's true what they say about slate. That slate also is not grayed, it's not rotted, and it's guaranteed for the life of the building. Too bad they didn't use that kind of slate in German Village when it was built, because all the slate roofs would be black and solid right now if they had.
Right. I think most of what is here is called Pennsylvania.
That's right.
Ribbon slate.
That's correct.
And ribbon because apparently of the deformity
Yes.
in it.
And that's what you see when it starts graying, and that's when it starts rotting.
So you've told me before about how badly this house was in shape. Tell me a little bit more. You've told about it was like a one-time owner, and there was she was a
Same
smoker,
family.
and
Same family, and she was when she died, she was in her 80s, and she was born in this house or in that general time, and it was built by her grandmother and her mother. So she had lived there in the whole property, and when we stripped the wallpaper, there was a children's writing behind the wallpaper, which was sort of interesting. Of course, one coat of wallpaper. She said when she died, I had met her once. She's an interesting old lady. She had a couple of pianos here, taught music, and a lot of very prominent people in Columbus were doing piano, learned to play the piano here. And one of the interesting things when she played the piano, all her students would give her a potted plant, and she had no green thumb at all. And when the potted plant died, usually probably from non-watering, she'd put the plant, which was the pot was wrapped in tinfoil, in the basement. And there must have been 100 of those things sitting in the basement of dead potted plants with aluminum foil around the pot. Anyway, she was more interested, she was an artist, and she was more interested in music than she was in repairs. So the eaves were all rotted out, the plumbing was probably 1950s, and it suited her, but it was certainly not up to standard for the times. And so that's one of the first things we had to do, is to get the electric and the plumbing under control.
So as far as you know, she wasn't married, didn't raise a family
Never got
here.
married, and she never got married, and well, actually, as a young girl, she went to Juilliard, which is the predecessor to Juilliard, and was very talented pianist. She practiced hours a day, and I bet if she had been a man, she would have been a concert pianist, but at the same time, she was very active in the arts. And we have a lot of programs from the days when Columbus was in the 20s and the 30s, that she was very active in going to all of these events that were in Columbus and in New York. She went to New York many times too, just to keep in touch with the art scene.
Did you do much of the work yourself here, you and Janet, or did you hire most of that out?
We started, yeah, a lot of the contractor work, we didn't know any contractors. And think back in those days, they didn't have the big box stores with all of the equipment. You had to go to an electric supplier company to get electrical stuff. You couldn't just go to the hardware store because they didn't have that stuff in the hardware store. So we did a lot of the cleanup, a lot of the scraping wallpaper, a lot of the hard work, sometimes painting, but mostly helping contractors to keep the prices down. But as we worked on things, we realized that some of it was beyond our expertise, plumbing particularly. Now, I probably could tackle the plumbing today because I've learned, one of the things about having an old house is you have to learn your house and you have to learn a trade because people teach you as you go. And so I have quite a pretty good knowledge, working knowledge of plumbing. My dad was an electrician, so I have some electricians. I have a healthy respect for electrical matters. And so we were very fortunate to find some decent contractors, particularly Richard at the carriage house, for instance. He did a fantastic job back there. And he did our attic too, which started off as a raceway for Hot Wheels and ended up to be a master bedroom. So you can imagine the revisions it's gone through to get that way. But at the same time, we were fortunate not to get into some of the terrible contractors that we've seen other people involved in. I think that one of the great things we had was found people who respected old houses and knew how to work with them. Men like Mr. Reinhardt, a German carpenter who was very skilled. And then we had good architecture help through John B. Hall, who did a lot of our design work, and we sort of keep in touch with making sure that everything sort of blends together. Rick Sherman did some great decorating. We just thought he did a wonderful job. And as rooms were done, we tried to keep them sort of like the way they were done without trying to paint over or do anything else to them. With some nice woodwork here, I didn't want to paint over that. We were very careful as we did things like electrical, that we had enough sockets and things around so that, and switches, so that things would not need to be torn up again when we did it the final time.
And this house was about, what, 1895?
But 1895 to later, someone said it took 3 years to build this house. Well, it's secondhand from the owner, Ms. Kazilius, the lady who died in the house. They said that they built the foundation the first year, they built the frame the second year, and they plastered it the third year because they wanted the house to settle before the plaster was done. True or not, have no idea. But that was secondhand. We heard that from the executor, who was told that by the previous owner. Of course, she had been a little girl when all of this was happening, and so she would have no direct knowledge of that herself, probably.
So this was a little over 40 years ago. What was it like going before the commission then?
The commission was very helpful, much more helpful than you would probably today, because they had time to sit down and talk to you. They call it conceptual approval now. I'm not sure they even had such a thing, but you could go in and talk to you about your ideas, and they would help you in this one. One of the things that I found with the carriage house, though, being a pioneer is tough. At that time, there were no carriage house rentals. That people had to, nowadays they're building garages with apartments on top. To do that, to redo that carriage house, the commission and the city required us to go to city council and get a special variance to have two residences on the same lot. Didn't make sense to me. I still don't understand it. We had to do that. Fortunately, a lot of nail biting and a lot of discussions. It got done. It was no problem. It's just a big time waster. And of course, the city's saying it was condemned. You've got to start showing progress, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I think we did a fine job with respect to getting good information and good help. And so therefore, what happened when we were actually doing the work, we were pretty informed as to what we wanted to do and how it should be done.
And when you say carriage house, you mean an actual carriage house?
It is an actual carriage house. It had horses in there. As a matter of fact, one of the beams had been chewed by a horse, and Janet wanted to leave it a little window there so you could see it, but it's too fancy a looking place in there now. And it was basically a stable person may have lived upstairs. We don't know. It was a room upstairs that somebody lived there. Very rudimentary toilet facilities, but at the same time it was a lot of drainage and a lot of bricks and things in there, and I'm sure you could have put a carriage in there. It would be big enough for a couple carriages, but I know at least one horse lived there.
It's my understanding that there probably weren't a lot of horses in the South End because of the expense, and you're in an urban area. But some of these larger houses certainly did have.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you would say that along this street there's a lot of large, stable-sized carriage houses. And they truly were carriage houses where they kept the carriage. There's a carriage block that was here that's in front of the carriage house out there. And I would say that just for probably on, maybe, I don't even know the percentage, but very few people had carriages, very few people had horses. But you didn't have any other way to get around unless you rode a horse, and so maybe there was only a horse and no carriage. I have no idea. But at least we know a horse lived in our carriage house, so we have a true horse stable at one time.
An outhouse or cistern or anything like that?
An outhouse was built as part, and this is a wonderful story, an outhouse was built as part of the carriage house. And so that meant that it was a nice sewer line that went directly from that outhouse through and under this house and to the city sewer, and so therefore we did not have to pay for a sewer tap, which kept the cost of redoing the carriage house considerably down. It was a reduction of several $1,000s because we didn't have to have a sewer tap.
Now, of course, these outhouses started without sewer taps, but I think, into the early to middle part of the 20th century, some of them may have been plumbed to a certain degree.
This was actually plumbed with water out there. Of course, the pipes didn't last. But these had large sewer tile and were built as part of the construction. So therefore, they were all tied in. When they got in the 1880s, by the time they got to building these houses, they were all done for sewer tied into the city sewer. Now, as to water, there was evidence that the place we used its cistern, which is a big cylindrical storage facility, which is still accessible because we built over it, but we bridged over it so it didn't destroy it. That collects rainwater, and then there was a lead pipe from that would go into the basement, and a pump. And the pump would direct the water all the way to the 3rd floor. In there was a zinc-lined cabinet, like twice, maybe 4 times larger than a bathtub. That was, you would pump water up there, and then gravity would come back down. And so when we moved into the house, there were three pipes coming, for instance, to the bathroom. There was a hot water, a cold water, and a lead pipe for rainwater. And that rainwater they would use to wash their clothes and wash their hair, because it was such it was not hard water like the rest of the city water is.
And how was the rainwater collected? In the cistern?
In the cistern, pumped up to the 3rd floor, and gravity fed down to the 2nd floor bathroom.
And was that holding tank up there at the time?
Holding tank was there, and when we remodeled the 3rd floor, we took it out, but it was intact and it was in great shape. Quite frankly, it could have held the water. We didn't have any water in it, and I didn't want to put any in there. But it certainly was a well-constructed, and even had sawdust around the zinc to keep perhaps padded somehow.
That's interesting.
No, it was. This house is really amazing, and of course you learn a lot as you own the house. You start asking questions, and as you ask questions, people tell you, and then you say, "Well, I have a lead pipe in this place." And even the house next door has a lead pipe from its cistern, and it did sort of the same thing. Now, I don't know where the storage tank was, because it was gone by the time we investigated. But this one definitely pumped all the way to the 3rd floor, and the gravity fed down.
Because at one point you did buy the house directly to the west.
Yes, we did. It was a double, and we had small children. And one of the things we needed to do was to make sure we controlled who lived there. There had been some undesirable tenants before we owned it, and so we decided we wanted to make sure that we knew the people and we were able to control that. The German Village, there was never a question that this street was going to be a good street. But if you think back in those days, German Village had turned the corner, but there were still some spots in it, particularly Schiller Park, where I would say that the element was not desirable. There were there's lots of places in town in those days where there were things in public parks that you didn't want anybody to be involved in. And as things got cleaned up, fortunately, we knew it was going to happen, but you had to go through some pretty tense times.
But Janet had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, Janet was actually instrumental in forming a group called the Friends of Schiller Park. She got our kids with small tots, and so she was more interested in getting other parents who had small children to do a playground. And I remember she went to Mel Dodge, who was the head of Parks and Recreation, and he says, "Well, we can get you a few $1,000s. Which do you want?" And he thought she was going to name some kind of a toy or something. And she says, "We want a brick and iron fence around the tot lot." And he says, "What?" She said, "I can get money for playground equipment, but I can't get it for bricks and mortar. And so if you put a fence there, we'll get this." And indeed, she worked with the city, and they did you can still see that brick and iron around it. Great addition to the neighborhood, and that was the start of the Friends of Schiller improvement in the park. They Mexico Forge playground equipment, first in the city to use that. As a matter of fact, they searched it out. In those days, they were using railroad ties and telephone poles and all this, and they found this Mexico Forge thing. And when the city found out how long it would last, they agreed the fun part of it, or however it worked out, we had the first in the city with this Mexico Forge playground equipment. We painted and oiled and fixed up the old playground equipment so that it didn't squeak, and it worked. And so gradually things were being improved in that part of the park. In addition, things kept happening. The city agreed to come forth with matching funds. And one of the great things, the Actors Summer Theater had just started in the park, and so they had a wish list, and Nationwide stepped up to $100,000, and so the city contributed $200,000, and in those days $300,000 went a long way, and they built that nice amphitheater that we have now to replace concrete slabs that were up before. Again, all the German singing societies got together and they contributed toward redoing the Schiller statue, which has been redone again, but at the same time saved that statue from being just completely rotting away.
And then you have lights, carriage path.
Lights, and then the Grace's Garden. It's a beautiful city park now. Grace's Garden and the plantings in the park and the landscaping. Well, the other thing we did early on was started planting trees. And if you look at some of the mature trees in this park today, are trees that were planted by the earlier times of Friends of Schiller. We made almost a holiday out of Arbor Day, celebrating Arbor Day, and with the city council, and wore Friends of Schiller t-shirts and all that. So it was really a big event, and nobody had celebrated Arbor Day in years, including the kids. And there's a lot of trees in that park that have been planted since the Friends of Schiller came into business.
You mentioned your children. You made a conscious decision fairly early on to raise them here at a time when a lot of parents were choosing to either send their kids to Catholic school or to move outside the village. What led you to make that decision? Interesting.
I think that one of the main factors is we like this house so much. The location is beautiful, as you can tell. You know, it's right across from the park. We fortunately found a nice, good house with good bones, and we started making it the way we wanted it. The kids couldn't make the lottery that gets them into the local schools. The local schools that they would have attended were not very good. So we did. We looked into the suburbs, and we considered very seriously moving out of Columbus and going to a suburb. And I think the best part of that decision was looking around and not finding any city school that was really, even the magnet schools weren't all that great. So my daughter fortunately got into CSG, and then my son went to Academy, and there was a lot of transporting back and forth, but at the same time, I think they got a great education. They went on to college, and growing up in the city doesn't hurt anybody. If you learn urban ways, they transpose well to anywhere you live. My daughter lives in New York City, and I think the lessons she learned around Schiller Lake probably keep her safe in New York City. And at the same time, my son now lives outside of Charlotte, which is not quite the atmosphere of urbanness that you would think, since it's in a smaller town. But at the same time, he has a general understanding of what it's like to live in the city, and you lock your bike up and you lock your doors, and the things that you normally, some kids growing up don't do. I never did that when I was growing up. You leave your bike in front yard and be in the front yard the next day or the next week whenever you came back to it. But in the city, you have a different way of living, if you will.
Tell me a little bit about what German Village looked like when you moved here in '75.
It's interesting. German Village was not as, I could squint and say it looks the same. It hasn't been a lot of changes. I think the finishes have been a little bit more professional. In the early days, people would just sort of flash things together, not using the best of materials, enough to get by. Now I think there's great pride in ownership. I think you can see people putting, instead of using pine, they would be using redwood. They do things, they clean up things that perhaps they didn't need to clean up in the old days. A lot of people were speculating perhaps in those days, some today, but I think speculators realize that high quality means a better return on whatever you do. And I'm just delighted to see some of the great projects that have gone on and have taken just dilapidated things and turned them into #1 type stellar projects.
Has it been pretty steady since
It's
you've been here?
steady, and I think the thing that's happening even more recently is more people have decided this is where they want to live, not as a transition, but as a final place. A lot of empty nesters coming back here. They, again, take pride in living here, and once they get in this community, the community atmosphere just takes part exactly where German Village wants it to be. People get to know people, they have events, they go together, they have a friendship develops, and it is a community type thing. We have people who live here longer than 2 or 3 years. There's still a lot of renters, and they don't perhaps get involved in the community as much as people who own the house. But those who own the houses are sort of feel of camaraderie with others and get involved in committees with the German Village Society. I think one of the things that we have been pretty successful at is keeping the commercial interests out. That's always been an issue with the German Village Society. At least in the old days, everybody wanted to be in one of these houses and converted into a law firm, a doctor's office, or something else that totally was not occupied at night. It was not a residence, and so there were many objections and demonstrations and meetings about not converting houses. But at least I think maybe the commission is still holding steady on that. But making commercial out of residential was a big issue, and I think that's protected the village over the years. I certainly don't want to have candy stores and coffee houses all over the place down here. I think the mix is pretty good now. Probably was even a little bit better in the old days. But we have a grocery store, we have a coffee shop, we have a variety store, we have things we can access. And my Lord, the things that have changed outside of the village have taken a lot of that pressure off. There are shopping centers that are easily accessible, that you can get things that you really want, that you don't need to have some of these huge stores in your neighborhood to be able to get to. And Amazon, and yeah. It comes at your doorfront.
7 days a week.
7 days a week, that's right.
And as we're talking here in 2017, we're seeing a lot happen in other parts of the city, particularly the short north comes to mind, where it seems every block now is going to have a high-rise on it, which to me seems like it's detracting from the charm of the short north in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's short north. Short north is, when I first moved to Columbus, was an area you didn't want to be caught after nighttime. You would just wanted to avoid that area. And I went through it quite a bit, getting from downtown to the university area back and forth. But you could tell it was a neighborhood that was ripe. Usually you'll see artists move in, and then from then on it gets to be an in place. Everybody wants to go there, and they did, and it's become quite a nice area of town. Great restaurants, great art museums, and galleries and what have you. But it's getting really pricey now, and I think the new trend is probably going west, because that's where some cheap real estate is. But at the same time, at that area of the city, all of this takes a lot of pressure off of German Village. I think I see art as probably artists were down here. I remember artists that lived in these houses and had little galleries in their houses, and were well known for German Village arts things. But as the village matured and got bigger, they sold out and moved on to where it was cheaper. And I can't blame them, but I think they helped start German Village, and they had the eye of, hey, this would look good if it was this color rather than just put this on it. Fortunately, we had some great volunteers on the commission. Those ladies that were the head of the commission and members of the commission deserve a lot of our respect, because they did such a wonderful job of guiding people in the right direction.
Who were some of these people who were on the commission in the early days of your living here?
Oh, I remember Ann Lilly and Miss Battle and
Judy Kitchen.
Judy Kitchen was she was a staunch advocate of keeping it like it is. I mean, she was I don't know what to get into. She was not flexible at all on any of this stuff. It was sort of fun, but at the same time, her voice helped mediate some of this pressure to develop. I think there was a feeling, most everybody wanted to see German Village be successful. The question is, what does success mean? Does success mean higher real estate prices? Or does success mean stores in the neighborhood? Does success mean having lots of tourists? One of the days, in the early days, there was a lot of pressure to have tourists down here. They would invite busloads of people and walk around, look how great we are. I hope that era is nice, but it's gone. I mean, we don't need to have as many tourists down here because they'll go and find this. They will find this place no matter what. But June Battles and Ann Lilly are two people I remember working with, because that's when I did most of my interactions with the commission. And Al Rosen, I think it's Al. It was Mike Rosen, fabulous guy. I mean, he was so helpful over the years, and they have had others that were very just helpful. And they would you'd see them on the street, and they would ask a question, and they would be very happy to help you. Everybody wanted the same thing. They wanted the village to look nice and to be nice.
I'd like to hear a few details about some of the stores, some of the shops, some of the restaurants that were here then that we don't have anymore, and maybe a way of life we don't see now. I look at all the old historical video, and it seems like we celebrated a German culture a little bit more back then. Perhaps it was just kitsch, but you would see people on holidays in dirndls and lederhosen, and you would hear the bands and see them marching down 3rd Street.
I'm old, but I'm not that old.
Okay.
Okay.
So you didn't see so much of that.
I didn't see a lot of that stuff. I remember Fred and Howard had the Hausfrau, which was a real, it's not just a wine store. It was a real variety store. You could go in and get a loaf of bread, and you get milk, and you get all the other stuff. And they were just fun. The kids loved going there because they were such fun people to be there. Other stores have evolved, but I don't see that. I don't remember a lot of the older type stores. I do remember up at the North End there was a great antique store in the building that next to Katzinger's. And I'd go in there, and Ray Marion would just be the fount of information about antiques. I mean, we're talking early antiques, 18th century, and he could tell you all of the details that were made this very good. There's a store like that can't exist anywhere now anymore. Brown Furniture is no longer what it was.
Well, we don't have antique stores.
We really don't, because it takes a lot of sales per square foot, and German Village real estate is pretty expensive, particularly commercial real estate. And so there's a lot of antiques around, but in cheaper facilities and in the fringes, particularly antique hardware and things like that. In the old days, you could buy porch steps and things like that, but from people who had picks that would go all over the city and buy this stuff. It doesn't happen anymore because people realize that these stone steps are worth a lot of money, and they don't just give them away.
Well, thank goodness we still do have some of the small shops, like the small coffee shops, the small sandwich shops, and so forth, that have not been priced out.
No, that's true, and they have a loyal following from people that frequent them, and I think the village is what the community is. Well, I'll meet you at what's the name, and we'll do this. But at the same time, Starbucks fits right in, even though I miss the cheese and the ice cream that Isley's used to have. But at the same, and the bookstore is a wonderful draw from all over the city. It's interesting to walk through all of those rooms and to see what's there. The real estate offices are real estate offices.
Yeah. It's interesting to me to be walking along South 3rd on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon and meet people who are obviously not from here, and the wide-eyed looks on their faces, and they're taking pictures, and it's like they've never seen anything like this before.
That's true, and it's interesting too, because in the old days, and it's probably telling them today, tourists come in, and they say, where's German Village? They want to see a Disneyland type creation of shop, 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 and maybe a house or two. It is a residential area, and it is where we live, and that's why I like it so much. I don't want it to be shop, 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 shop. But people somehow get the concept, well, German Village is such a great place, let's go visit there and see all the shops, shop, shop, shops. And there are not a lot of shop, 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 shops.
Where can we get all the German food? Where can we buy all the beer steins?
And Schwitz does well. And George was a nice guy. I really liked George a lot. And Jeff and all those people are really wonderful people. And they have kept the place pretty much like it was when I remember it. I think we're very fortunate to have a lot of the stores still in existence that have been there. Helen Winnemore's, when the kids were small, we used to go in and get birthday presents for their friends, and their friends would marvel as to where they got something that nobody else had seen. These were pre-internet days, and nobody had seen something like that Helen carried in there.
And that was when Helen had the shop.
That's when she had the shop, and that's when they did the fancy ribbons and all of that stuff. It was actually a great place to take the kids.
Sid, I can't think of anything else. Is there anything else you'd like to add about living here over the years?
Well, living here is it's been a lot of fun, and I think one of the things that I have been sort of glad to see is that we've had generations of new friends. As we've been here many years, we had friends who have moved on or died or gone to Florida or whatever else, and then we found another layer of friends, and they same, and we just seem to uncover new people that we like being with. And I think Janet was instrumental in getting this Village Connections thing started. I think that's maybe a self-preservation, I don't know, but in any event, I think it's great that we can keep our old friends here, but the fact is we find new ones all the time. I like the fact that, you know, who would ever know we'd have euchre groups? Who would know that we have friends that are younger than our children, but we have fun going to things and doing things with them. And I think people from all over the city would come down and say, Lindy's is the best restaurant, or G. Michael's is the best restaurant. And we're fortunate to have it right here in our midst. We complain about a lot of the traffic things and the bad things about the village, but sometimes overlook some of the really wonderful things. And I think the best thing about the entire village is the community, the people that live here.
Thank you, Sid.
Thank you. John enjoyed it.